Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we unpack the most important issues shaping the life sciences industry. Today, we're tackling a topic that sits at the intersection of science, policy, and ethics: clinical trial diversity.
Over the past few years, we've seen growing recognition that clinical trials, long considered the gold standard of evidence, haven't always represented the real world populations who depend on these therapies. For decades, women, racial and ethnic minorities, older adults, and people from rural communities have been underrepresented in research. And that lack of representation has consequences. It can skew efficacy data, mask safety risks, and limit our understanding of how treatments perform across diverse patient populations.
Exactly. And that's why today's conversation is so critical. In 2020, the FDA began emphasizing trial diversity through guidance documents and public workshops. Then, in late 2022, Congress made it official. As part of the Food and Drug Omnibus Reform Act, FDORA, sponsors are now required to submit diversity action plans for most Phase 3 and pivotal clinical trials. This marks the first time diversity isn't just encouraged, it's mandated by law.
That's a huge shift for the industry. For years, sponsors talked about diversity as a nice to have, ain't something you addressed through recruitment campaigns or community partnerships. But now it's a compliance issue with expectations for measurable outcomes, clear strategies, and public accountability.
And it's not just the US making this move. The European Medicines Agency, EMA, Health Canada, and regulators across Asia are also rolling out frameworks that promote more inclusive trial designs. What we're witnessing is a global reckoning, a recognition that the future of medicine must reflect the diversity of the people it serves.
Let's start with why diversity in trials matters so much. The science is clear. Biological and social factors influence how patients respond to treatment. Differences in genetics, metabolism, diet, environmental exposure, and even access to care can all impact safety and efficacy outcomes. For example, certain hypertension drugs have been shown to work differently across racial groups. Similarly, breast cancer subtypes are more prevalent among specific populations, meaning trial results based on narrow demographics can misrepresent the real world picture.
Exactly. And when we look at the data, the gap is still wide. According to an FDA analysis of clinical trials from 2015 to 2022, white patients made up nearly 75% of participants, while black patients represented about 8%, and Hispanic or Latino patients just 11%, despite making up much higher proportions of the U.S. population. Women are also underrepresented in certain therapeutic areas like cardiovascular disease and oncology, where outcomes can differ significantly by sex.
And it's not just about race or gender. Age diversity is another major issue. Many pivotal studies exclude older adults or those with comorbidities, even though those are often the very patients who will use the drug post approval. So, when those therapies reach the market, physicians are left to extrapolate data from populations that don't match their real world patients.
That's what these new mandates are trying to fix. The FDA's draft guidance, released in 2024, outlines what diversity action plans should include: enrollment goals by race, ethnicity, sex, and age, rationale for those targets, specific strategies to achieve them, such as expanding trial sites or partnering with community clinics, contingency plans if recruitment falls short.
Sponsors must submit these plans with their investigational new drug or IND applications, and the FDA can now hold them accountable if they fail to meet their stated commitments.
That's a big deal. Historically, the FDA could only recommend best practices. It couldn't enforce them. Now, diversity planning has become a core component of trial design, not an afterthought.
And yet, implementation won't be easy. Recruiting diverse participants isn't as simple as adding new sites or translating materials. There are deep structural barriers: medical mistrust, financial burdens, geographic access, and cultural disconnects that have built up over generations. A 2022 NIH survey found that 41% of minority respondents cited distrust of pharmaceutical companies as a top reason for not participating in trials.
Exactly. And when you think about the historical context, it makes sense. From the Tuskegee syphilis study to the exclusion of women of childbearing potential, In trials throughout the 1980s and 1990s, underrepresentation didn't happen by accident. It was built into the system. Undoing that will take time, transparency, and genuine engagement.
That's why we're seeing a shift toward community based research models. Instead of expecting patients to travel to major academic centers, sponsors are partnering with local clinics, faith based organizations, and advocacy groups to build trust. Technology also plays a key role here. Decentralized trials, telemedicine, and wearable devices can lower logistical barriers by allowing participants to engage from home.
Right, and that's one of the most exciting intersections between diversity and innovation. The same digital tools that accelerated research during COVID-19 are now being used to make trials more inclusive. For example, e-consent platforms can provide study information in multiple languages and formats, making it easier for patients to understand and enroll.
But there's a flip side. Technology can help, but it can also exclude. Not every community has equal access to broadband, smartphones, or digital literacy. So sponsors have to balance convenience with equity, making sure innovation doesn't unintentionally widen the gap.
And that's really the challenge. How do we move from policy to practice? Mandates are important, but they only work if companies can operationalize them. If diversity becomes embedded in every part of clinical development, from protocol design to site selection to data analysis.
Exactly. And some companies are leading the way. Pfizer, for instance, launched its Multicultural Center of Excellence to guide diverse enrollment across global trials. Moderna has partnered with the National Urban League and Morehouse School of Medicine to increase participation from historically underrepresented groups. We're also seeing CROs, contract research organizations, build diversity metrics into their performance dashboards.
That's the direction we're heading in. Diversity not as a side initiative, but as a core operational and compliance function.
So let's talk about what implementation actually looks like.
Because it's one thing to have a diversity plan on paper, it's another to build it into the DNA of how trials are designed and run.
Exactly. One of the first big shifts we're seeing is in site selection.
For years, sponsors defaulted to the same academic medical centers, often clustered in large metro areas with limited demographic variety. Now, companies are mapping social determinants of health to identify where underrepresented patient groups actually live, then placing trial sites accordingly.
Right? And that's where partnerships come in. Sponsors are collaborating with federally qualified health centers, community hospitals, and even local pharmacies to serve as trial access points.
The idea is simple. If the patients can't come to the trial should come to the patients.
There's also a major data element here. According to Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development, nearly 80% of U.S. clinical trial participants live within 2 hours of a study site, but those sites are disproportionately located near wealthier and less diverse populations. By redistributing just 10 to 15% of sites into historically underrepresented communities, sponsors can double or even triple minority participation rates.
That's a huge return on investment, and not just from a compliance perspective.
More diverse data means more accurate science. It reduces post market safety surprises and improves global labeling strategies. If your efficacy data reflects the populations who will actually take the drug, then you're better positioned with regulators and payers worldwide.
Exactly. And let's not overlook community engagement.
Diversity mandates have forced sponsors to think long term and not just about one study, but about building relationships that last beyond a single trial.
Some companies are hosting educational workshops or sponsoring local health fairs, while others are partnering with patient advocacy groups to co design outreach strategies.
And when that's done authentically, it works.
A recent study in JAMA Network Open found that when sponsors partnered with trusted community leaders, like pastors or local health advocates, enrollment among Black participants increased by more than 60%.
That's the kind of data that proves representation isn't just a moral imperative, it's an operational advantage.
It's also reshaping the role of the investigator.
For years, the same 10% of high volume investigators ran nearly 80% of US trials. But those investigators don't always reflect the diversity of the patient population.
Now, sponsors are investing in investigator training programs, teaching new physicians from diverse backgrounds how to run compliant trials, manage data integrity, and navigate the regulatory process.
Exactly. The FDA's Clinical Trial Diversity Network, launched in 2024, is a great example.
It pairs experienced investigators with new researchers from underrepresented regions to mentor them through the trial startup process. The goal is to expand the pool of qualified sites so that diversity is built in from the ground up.
And let's not forget technology enablement. We touched on decentralized trials earlier, but tools like electronic patient reported outcomes and remote monitoring are becoming key enablers of inclusion.
If a participant can report side effects or fill out questionnaires from home, you reduce the burden of travel, which is one of the top reasons minority and rural participants drop out of trials. There's also a growing conversation around compensation equity.
Historically, many trial participants have been unpaid or undercompensated for their time and travel, especially in lower income communities.
Now, sponsors are rethinking stipends and reimbursement frameworks to remove financial barriers. Some CROs have started offering same day digital payments for participants. Simple, but incredibly effective.
Right. And the data supports that approach. The Journal of Clinical and Translational Science reported that trials offering upfront transportation or childcare support saw a 35% higher enrollment rate among underrepresented participants.
It's a reminder that inclusion isn't just about awareness, it's about reducing practical burdens.
Another area that's changing quickly is data transparency.
The FDA has started publishing annual reports showing which companies meet their diversity goals and which fall short. That kind of public accountability is motivating sponsors to invest more seriously in compliance infrastructure.
Exactly. And that brings us to measurement. How do you actually track whether diversity initiatives are working?
Some organizations are developing real time diversity dashboards, integrating enrollment data from multiple sites to monitor representation as the trial progresses. That allows teams to adjust strategies mid study, like adding a new site or running targeted outreach, instead of waiting until the trial is complete.
That's so important because traditionally companies only looked at demographics after the fact.
Now, diversity is being tracked alongside key performance indicators like enrollment rate, data quality, and protocol deviations. It's becoming part of operational excellence.
Absolutely. And regulators are paying attention.
In recent feedback, the FDA has praised sponsors who incorporate data driven course corrections during enrollment, noting that this proactive approach aligns with the intent of the diversity mandate, not just compliance on paper, but impact in practice.
And we can't overlook the role of global harmonization.
While the FDA is leading the charge with formal diversity action plans, the EMA and other regulators are following closely.
The EMA's 2023 reflection paper on diversity calls for broader inclusion, not just in ethnicity, but also in geography, ensuring that low and middle income countries have representation in global trials.
For multinational sponsors, this means thinking globally, but executing locally.
Exactly. And that's a great point. The idea that diversity in clinical trials isn't just about who participates, but how research is conducted.
It's about trust, access, and accountability.
The next phase of this conversation is about outcomes, how sponsors measure success, how regulators evaluate progress, and how this movement is reshaping the future of evidence generation.
So we've talked about the how, but what about the impact? Are these diversity mandates actually moving the needle yet? That's the million-dollar question. The short answer is yes, but unevenly.
According to a 2024 analysis, trials that implemented structured diversity action plans saw a 40% increase in minority enrollment compared to pre guidance studies. But that progress isn't consistent across all therapeutic areas.
Right. Oncology and infectious disease trials are leading the way, partly because those areas already had diverse patient bases due to public health outreach. But rare disease and cardiovascular studies are lagging.
It really depends on where companies have invested in community partnerships early.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that these mandates are forcing companies to rethink what representative data really means. It's not just about racial or ethnic diversity anymore. It's also about age, gender, and geography.
Take cardiovascular trials, for example. Older adults are the primary users of these drugs, yet They're often underrepresented because of comorbidities that exclude them from eligibility.
Yes, and that's changing now. Sponsors are reevaluating eligibility criteria to make them more inclusive. Instead of automatically excluding patients with common conditions like diabetes or hypertension, companies are designing adaptive protocols that reflect real world populations.
It's a subtle shift, but it's transforming how we think about external validity.
It's also feeding into the FDA's growing emphasis on real world evidence, RWE.
Regulators are increasingly accepting data from electronic health records, registries, and wearables as supplementary evidence, especially to fill gaps in populations underrepresented in traditional trials.
And that's where technology becomes a game changer.
AI and machine learning can analyze massive volumes of real world data to identify patterns that might otherwise be missed. For instance, an AI model could detect disparities in adverse event reporting across different ethnic groups, prompting targeted follow up studies.
Exactly. And it's not just retrospective. Some sponsors are piloting AI assisted trial recruitment tools that analyze de identified patient data to match eligible participants faster and more equitably.
A recent Deloitte survey found that AI driven recruitment increased minority enrollment by up to 25%, simply by reducing biases in how sites identify candidates.
That's a great example of technology supporting inclusion. But of course, it raises new challenges too, like data privacy, bias in algorithms, and ensuring transparency in how those tools make decisions.
Absolutely. If the algorithm itself reflects existing biases in healthcare data, which often underrepresents minorities, you risk perpetuating the same inequities you're trying to fix.
That's why algorithmic transparency is becoming part of the conversation around ethical trial design. Regulators want to see how sponsors validate these tools and monitor their outputs over time.
And globally, we're starting to see how these ideas take shape in different contexts.
In Europe, the EMA's diversity efforts have expanded beyond ethnicity to emphasize geographic inclusion, especially from Eastern and Southern European countries that were historically underrepresented in clinical research.
In Africa, initiatives like the Africa Clinical Trials Consortium are working to establish regionally led infrastructure so African patients are participants, not just data points.
Exactly. And in Asia, countries like Singapore and South Korea are becoming hubs for diverse trial populations, partly because they offer regulatory frameworks that encourage global inclusion.
Multinational sponsors are learning that to meet diversity mandates, they need not just new sites, but new ways of collaborating internationally. And
And it's creating ripple effects in manufacturing, too.
if you're testing your product in more countries, you need regional manufacturing or supply chain solutions to deliver investigational products efficiently.
Diversity isn't just about patients anymore. It's about the entire clinical operations ecosystem adapting to serve them.
That's such a good point.
We're seeing companies pilot modular trial models, where investigational drug supplies and data systems are regionally managed to reduce logistical barriers.
It's part science, part strategy, but it's what's required to make diversity operationally sustainable. And what I love about this moment is that it's changing mindsets. 5 years ago, diversity was a check the box topic for sponsors. Now it's part of risk management.
If your trial fails to enroll diverse participants, regulators can delay approval or request post market studies.
That's real accountability.
Exactly. And it's also part of investor conversations now. ESG investors are asking biopharma companies how they're ensuring equitable access to trials. It's becoming a marker of corporate responsibility, not just regulatory compliance.
So it's fair to say we've moved from why to how, and now we're entering the what's next phase. What does success look like 5 years from now?
I think success looks like sustainability, where diversity is built into every phase of development, not just one study at a time.
Where inclusion metrics are reported as standard practice and where Communities see clinical research as accessible and trustworthy.
That's when policy truly becomes practice.
And maybe most importantly, success means seeing real world outcomes reflect that progress, safer, more effective therapies for all populations.
Because that's what this is ultimately about, making medicine work for everyone.
Exactly. And that's a perfect segue into our final segment, the next generation of innovation.
How AI, hybrid trials, and global partnerships are redefining diversity, not as an obligation, but as a catalyst for better science and better healthcare.
It's fascinating how the conversation around diversity in clinical trials has evolved from being an ethical talking point to a measurable performance indicator.
Absolutely. 5 years ago, sponsors could justify low diversity numbers by saying it's hard to recruit. Now, regulators and even investors are saying, figure it out.
That shift has been accelerated by transparency. The FDA now requires sponsors to submit and publicly disclose their diversity action plans, and some of that information is being made visible to the public. Once diversity data becomes part of your public profile, it starts influencing how patients, advocacy groups, and even investors view your company.
Right, it's almost like ESG for clinical research. The way a company handles diversity is being seen as a reflection of its integrity.
Exactly, and it's pushing organizations to get creative. For example, Pfizer partnered with the National Black Church Initiative to host local enrollment drives for vaccine trials. AstraZeneca built long term partnerships with historically black colleges and universities, HBCUs, to support STEM training and clinical engagement. These aren't just one off outreach efforts, they're pipelines that will shape who participates in research for years to come.
That's such a good point. The sustainability angle. Too often, outreach happens only when recruitment is a problem. But real change comes from relationship building, staying in communities after the trial ends.
And there's evidence that this works. Trials that invest in post study community engagement report significantly higher participation in follow up studies because participants feel respected and informed.
Exactly. And that's where digital technology can really extend reach. Decentralized and hybrid trials allow participation from people who might never live near a research site: rural patients, caregivers, or those with mobility issues.
One analysis from applied clinical trials in 2024 found that hybrid studies with remote data collection saw 30% higher participation from underrepresented groups simply because the barriers to entry were lower.
Yes, but decentralization introduces new complexity too: regulatory oversight, data quality, and patient privacy. Sponsors need to ensure that when they expand reach, they don't compromise compliance.
For instance, if wearable devices are used to monitor patients remotely, sponsors must confirm that data privacy rules are strictly followed. Otherwise, you risk eroding the very trust you're trying to build.
Exactly. And that's why the FDA and EMA are encouraging the use of risk-based monitoring frameworks for decentralized trials, systems that focus oversight where it matters most, while using digital audit trails to ensure integrity.
We're also seeing regulators start to harmonize on remote data standards, which is key if we want global adoption. Um,
Speaking of harmonization, let's talk about global collaboration for a moment. Because diversity looks different depending on where you are. In the US, it's often about racial and ethnic representation. In Europe, it's about geographic equity. And in Asia or Africa, it's about ensuring local populations have access to global research.
Exactly. One of the most inspiring examples is the African Vaccine Regulatory Forum, AVAREF, a regional collaboration that's helping African regulators coordinate multi country trials and build review capacity. It's not just about inclusion, it's about empowerment.
Instead of Western sponsors running everything, you're seeing African investigators lead multinational trials. And that's the kind of structural change that will define the next era of global health equity.
That's the ultimate goal, shared ownership. And with that comes shared data.
Real world evidence collected across regions can be used to improve global health decisions. The challenge is standardizing that data so it can actually inform regulatory reviews. That's where frameworks like ICHM 14, currently in draft, will be critical. It's focused on harmonizing diversity and representativeness in global submissions.
And there's another element we haven't talked about yet, the business case for diversity.
Beyond compliance, there's a clear economic argument. Studies from the Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development show that trials with diverse populations are more likely to yield generalizable results, reducing the need for post-market studies and lowering total development costs by up to 10%.
In other words, inclusion isn't just the right thing to do, it's good business.
Exactly. And let's not forget about market access. When payers and policymakers evaluate coverage decisions, they increasingly look for evidence that a drug works across populations. If your pivotal trial underrepresents a major demographic, that can delay reimbursement or even limit formulary inclusion in some markets.
So, in a way, diversity is becoming a form of regulatory risk management and commercial strategy all at once.
That's right. And it's also shaping workforce strategies. We're seeing CROs hire community engagement specialists, cultural competency officers, and even diversity liaisons who specialize in trial design.
This multidisciplinary approach is key. You need statisticians, sociologists, and patient advocates at the same table.
Exactly. It's about designing trials that are fit for purpose, scientifically rigorous, but also socially responsible.
And that's where AI and predictive analytics come back in. Sponsors can now model expected recruitment demographics before the first patient is even screened.
By analyzing population-level data, algorithms can identify which trial sites are most likely to reach specific demographics. So you can plan smarter, not just harder.
It's exciting, but we need to remember that predictive modeling is only as good as the data it's trained on. If social determinants of health aren't represented in your data sets, you're missing context.
That's why partnerships with health systems, insurers, and even public health departments are so valuable. They provide the contextual data that traditional clinical systems often lack.
Exactly. We're moving into an era where precision medicine meets population health.
The intersection of genomics, digital biomarkers, and real-world data is revealing new patterns of efficacy and safety, but only if the populations studied are representative of the real world.
Otherwise, precision medicine risks becoming exclusive medicine.
And that's the heart of this conversation, making sure the innovation we're investing in truly reaches everyone.
So, as we wrap up today's conversation, it's clear that diversity in clinical trials is no longer a side initiative. It's becoming the backbone of credible, ethical, and future ready research.
Absolutely. We're witnessing a real transformation.
It's not just about meeting FDA requirements or ticking compliance boxes. It's about reshaping the way science is done. The end goal is that a medicine's safety and effectiveness reflect every person it's meant to help, not just a subset of the population.
Exactly. And what's powerful is how this conversation ties together so many threads: regulation, technology, community engagement, and even manufacturing. The clinical trial of the future will be data-driven, globally coordinated, and deeply inclusive by design.
And that means accountability will keep rising. 5 years from now, we'll likely see diversity metrics reported alongside efficacy endpoints in major publications. Investors will expect them, regulators will demand them, and patients will look for them.
Because representation builds confidence in science, in companies, and in outcomes.
Right? And it's not just the big pharmaceutical players driving this change. Mid-sized biotech firms and emerging biopharma startups are proving that inclusion doesn't require massive budgets. It requires intent, planning, and partnership.
When you embed diversity planning early, before the protocol is even finalized, it becomes a strategic advantage rather than an operational burden.
Exactly. The earlier inclusion is built in, the less costly it becomes to achieve.
And with tools like AI recruitment models, hybrid trials, and patient-centric design frameworks, it's more feasible than ever to reach communities that were once left out of research entirely.
But perhaps the most important shift is cultural.
We're redefining what it means to do good science.
Science that reflects real people, all ages, races, genders, and backgrounds is stronger, more reliable, and ultimately more impactful.
When trust grows, participation grows. When participation grows, innovation accelerates.
Well said, Eric. And that's where organizations like Emma International come in.
At Emma, we help life sciences companies operationalize these complex mandates, from designing regulatory compliant diversity action plans to integrating data monitoring systems to ensuring that inclusion is embedded across every step of the clinical life cycle.
We bridge the gap between innovation and compliance, helping companies not just meet expectations, but set new standards for ethical global research.
That's the future, one where diversity isn't treated as an obstacle, but as a catalyst for better outcomes, better access, and better science.
Because ultimately, inclusion isn't just about who participates, it's about who benefits.
Exactly. And as the industry continues to evolve, one thing is certain: the next generation of clinical trials will be smarter, more equitable, and more transparent than ever before.
If your organization is navigating the new diversity requirements or looking to strengthen inclusivity in your research programs, reach out to us at info@emmainternational.com or visit emmainternational.com to learn more about how we can help.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Deep Dive.
We'll continue exploring the topics shaping the future of life sciences, from regulatory evolution to responsible innovation.
Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay innovative.